Now, I'm handing over to Matthew. Thank you,
Oh,
Matthew.
well, welcome everyone, and welcome most of all to Sarah Harkness. I'm just going to say very little in the beginning because I have my reasons for being very excited about your visit and about your book, which Literature for the People, which today's talk will be about. I proudly get yourself a copy if you don't already have one. I'm just going to introduce Sarah just a little bit, but I'm sure she'll be t speaking more about herself and her interest in the Macmillans. So I won't say very much and I'll let her get on with it. And then we'll have time for questions at the end if anyone should have them. Um, so I'm just going off your official biography. So
That's
has
fine.
worked, Sarah Harkness has worked in corporate finance for 20 years, laterally as a partner of Arthur Andersen. She spent 3 years as Pro-Chancellor of the University of Sheffield and is now a trustee of the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges and the chairs the Audit Committee of the Orthopedic Research UK and Oriel College, Oxford. She holds an honorary doctorate from Sheffield University and an honorary fellowship at Mansfield's College. I'm having problems
Cottage.
speaking. Or cottage, that actually sounds lovelier. And I just want to note the project that has become this book was honored with the Tony Lothian Prize by the Biographers Club for the best proposal for an uncommissioned biography. So and having read it, I say well deserved, and it's a very interesting project that I'm happy we have Sarah here to talk about today.
That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, thank you to Matthew for inviting me, and thank you to everyone who's come online from all around the world, which I'm very impressed by. I'll just do 2 minutes for you on why on earth I wrote this book in the first place, and to fill in the gaps a little bit. First of all, to say very firmly to all of you, I am not an academic. So please don't throw any academic-y questions at me at the end because I'll go, ooh, I don't know. I'm just a massive enthusiast for the people that I discovered and wanted to write about. And I came across the Macmillans by accident. I had written a book about an unknown Victorian female artist, and I couldn't get a publisher for her. But some people very kindly said to me, why don't you write about someone we've all heard of? To which the answer is, well, if you've heard of them, there's a book. And everyone tells me you can't write the same book twice. But I had this absolute stroke of luck, which was that the old artist I was writing about, who was called Nellie Erickson, and you won't have heard of her, was Alexander Macmillan's next door neighbour in South London for 15 years. And they became families, became very good friends. There were intermarriages. Nellie was published by Macmillan. She was standing at the graveside at Alexander Macmillan's funeral. So I had done some research into the Macmillan family while I was writing the Nellie book. And it suddenly was a light bulb moment. Actually, no one has written about the Macmillans for nearly 100 years. The last book about the setting up of Macmillan's publishing had been written in 1939, 1940, and there hadn't been anything since. So here was an opportunity. People I already knew a bit about, people I was very interested in, and people everyone has heard of, because particularly because their grandson is Harold Macmillan, who was Prime Minister, and yet no one had written about them for a long time. So I started my research and I wrote a couple of chapters and sent one off to an agent who told me that I had no credentials to write a book, which annoyed me quite a lot. So just before lockdown started, I went off and I did an MA in biography at the University of Buckingham under a wonderful woman called Jane Ridley, Professor Jane Ridley. And I wrote my thesis on Alexander Macmillan, and particularly on the year 1859 when he moves to London. And she encouraged me to submit a book proposal to this Biographers Club competition. And yes, I won the Tony Lothian Award, which was an enormous surprise to me. And I got an agent the next morning and a publishing deal with Macmillan about 3 weeks later. And obviously, it was Macmillan that was going to publish the book, and they did a fantastic job for me. That's my daughter who's in publishing says, "Mum, there's gold paint on the cover." They really loved this book, so I was very lucky. And the whole project, because of lockdown and because of doing the MA, it took me about 5 years. But luckily, I loved every minute of it, because the more I read about the brothers, and particularly about Alexander Macmillan, the more enthusiastic I got. And I hope that comes through in the book, because became a passion project for me, a real labour of love. So I'm delighted to be here talking to you about it today. And I'm going to try now and see if I can share my slides. So this is the one I want. Going to come up, share. Ooh, there. Can you all see that? Is it there? Good. Excellent. Okay. So, and now I'm going to try and move it on one. Screen sharing. Right. I've got an annoying thing here. How do I make that annoying thing go? Can you see the whole screen, or have you got stuff over it? You can see the whole screen.
We can see the whole screen.
Okay, good. Right, brilliant. I'm off. Okay, so my book, Literature for the People, is about two brothers, Daniel on the left of my screen, Alexander with the bow tie on the right, and how they created the publishing house that still bears their name 200 years later. It's a rags to riches story. It's the story of how a family could rise from a miserable little croft clinging to the rocks on the Isle of Arran to number 10 Downing Street in just 2 generations. So what I want to do today is try and bring the two brothers to life for you and to leave you as much in awe of their achievements and as enthusiastic about their life story as I am. Daniel and Alexander were two extraordinary men, and the more I learnt about them and the more I read what their friends said about them and the actual words in all the thousands of letters that they wrote, the more alive and impressive they became for me. So hopefully this isn't going to be a dry old history of a publishing house, however worthy or famous that house is, but it's the life story of two clever, funny, ambitious, warm-hearted men who just happened to launch an international publishing powerhouse. Daniel and Alexander were both born in grinding poverty. Their father was a crofter on the Isle of Arran, which is very beautiful, but a rather miserable thing to be. And it's where Daniel was born in 1813. By the time Alexander's born, 5 years later, the family had been driven from their land by the enclosure movement, and they decamped to Irvine in Ayrshire, which is a small port town, which did at least have a decent school, the Royal Academy. However, just as Daniel was getting into his stride as an enthusiastic and earnest schoolboy, his father died, and there was no more money for his education. He's 10 years old when this happens. The lucky chance was that his mother, who we know was a bookworm, a great reader, managed to get him apprenticed to the local bookseller. And this was January 1824, just over 200 years ago. Over the next few years, Daniel slowly worked his way up through the bookshops in Irvine, then to Glasgow, then down to Cambridge. And then in 1837, the year that Victoria comes to the throne, he finally finds a position in a London shop run by the Seeley brothers, Sweley. 2 years later, he persuades them to give a job to his little brother, Alexander, which was a great stroke of fortune because Alexander was 21 then, and he'd been racketing around a whole series of jobs, none of which had stuck or paid him any money. He'd been a schoolmaster. He'd been a shop assistant in a chemist's shop. He'd even tried life on the ocean wave. I think he'd sailed to the States, but he hadn't enjoyed any of it. So now the two brothers begin to work together. They're such a different pair, and what a strong combination that created. Daniel is a very serious but extremely ambitious young man, and he's already struggling with the tuberculosis that will kill him at the age of 44. But he's inspired by a strong religious faith, and he sees the book trade as his vocation. In London, he makes friends with young men who are becoming missionaries, and one of them is David Livingstone. But although Daniel envied them their calling, he knew he didn't have the health, he didn't have the constitution for Africa or India. So he decides to try and be effectively a missionary in England. He writes to a friend, "We booksellers, if we are faithful to our task, are trying to destroy and are helping to destroy all kinds of confusion and are aiding our great taskmaster to reduce the world into order and beauty and harmony. Bread we must have and gain it by the sweat of our brow or of our brain, and that is noble because God appointed. Yet that is not all. As truly as God is, we are his ministers and help to minister to the well-being of the spirits of men. At the same time, it is our duty to manage our affairs wisely, keep our minds easy, and not trade beyond our means." He's a businessman, Daniel Macmillan. Alexander's a very different character. He's less well-read than Daniel, but he'd seen a lot more of the world. He was more easygoing, more sociable. He found it easy to make friends, and he had the outgoing confidence of the youngest child. By 1843, the two men are feeling sufficiently at home as booksellers to try their hand at publishing. Their first book is a teacher training manual, and it came out that year. And at the same time, they take their first step into having their own bookshop. Initially, it's just a ground floor space in Aldersgate Street, underneath the Barbican now. But then, with significant financial assistance from a wealthy cleric, a man called Julius Hare, they bought their own shop in Cambridge. The rest, as they say, is history. Now, lots of people open bookshops, and quite a few have a crack at publishing. So why and how did these two succeed? Bearing in mind that they're two young brothers, they're 30 and 25 at this point. They're hundreds of miles from home. They've got no family support. They've got no money. They didn't go to university. And they're not exactly good investment risks. One of them's got TB, which is untreatable, and the other is often crippled by what we would call sciatica, or he called it sciatica. Actually, I think he's mostly crippled by the way they used to treat sciatica in those days, which is much worse than the pain itself. Daniel would have said they were successful because God was on their side. The Calvinist Baptist faith in which they were brought up preached the doctrine of predestination. But I don't think the answer lies in predestination. I think it's in the extraordinary character of the men themselves. Firstly, and pretty basically, both men worked incredibly hard. They're driven by a determination not to waste the chances they've been given. So when Daniel first takes possession of the little shop, it's at 17 Trinity Street in Cambridge. He worked so hard clearing it out and sorting the stock and painting and decorating that he brought on an appalling attack of consumption. And his brother Alexander had to be summoned from London to help out. So Alexander gets on the back of the first stagecoach out of London to Cambridge and brings on an appalling attack of sciatica. So by the time he gets to Cambridge, he's of less help than Daniel. Anyway, they're both workaholics. They get through this somehow. Alexander describes staying up, reading manuscripts and proofs until 2:30 in the morning, and he's always up at 6. The letter books in the British Library, which contain the copies of their outgoing correspondence, are quite extraordinary, and I spent an awful lot of time in the British Library. So I'm going to take one example. It's the book beginning May 1861, ending October that year. These are the carbon copies of the letters that Alexander sent, 800 pages of letters in one volume, all in Alexander's very clear handwriting. I don't know if you can see that. It looks a bit blurry in my photograph, but I hope you can tell. Actually, it's legible. Luckily for me, Alexander's writing is legible. I could nearly always work out what he was saying, which is a great relief because, I mean, for instance, I looked at the letterbooks of a man called F.G. Morris, and I couldn't understand a word he wrote. So thank goodness. And that's why nobody's writing biographies of F.G. Morris anymore, I think, because you just can't read his letters. So these letters, they range from little polite notes to authors chasing up proofs or organising copies for reviewers. But sometimes they're massively long, closely organised, argued responses to a writer to explain why he was turning something down. He'd read it. He wanted to tell the author exactly what he thought about it. One particular student from Balliol gets 4 pages of theological argument when Alexander could have just said no. Secondly, and crucially, they succeeded because they never lost sight of Daniel's vision that book selling and book publishing was nothing if it didn't have a moral and social purpose. All their hard work is driven by this belief. In the early 1840s, they're just 2 men with a little shop and a big dream in Cambridge. But by 1848, they'd become disciples of the man on the left here, Frederick Denison Morris, the leader of a movement that described itself as Christian socialism. This was an energetic response to the crisis of faith in industrial Britain. As towns and cities grew, sucking in millions of workers away from the close local communities of the countryside, the Church of England was losing ground. There weren't enough clergymen or churches in towns to minister, to the spiritual needs of the poor, the hungry, the oppressed working class. And those that there were didn't seem to understand the needs of the population they served. So in its place arose the spectre of socialism. And anyone who looked across the channel to Europe could see that socialism was not a great idea. It led to riot, it led to revolution. In England, the Chartist movement of the 1840s and the anti-Corn Law protests seemed to emphasize that there was division between the classes that was only going one way. The leaders of the Christian socialists believed that they could avert appalling violence and bloodshed in Britain, but only if society put into practice the teachings of the New Testament. They've got to get back to basics. They've got to get back to the Bible. They've got to look after the interests of all men, not just the wealthy capitalists and the industrialists. Daniel and Alexander Macmillan called F.D. Morris the prophet in capital letters. He's the principal inspiration of the movement, and men such as Tom Hughes and Charles Kingsley were firm vocal disciples. And the Macmillan Brothers, who had always believed that educating the workers and giving them access to good literature was the way to bring people together, they were more than happy to volunteer services as publishers to the Christian Socialist movement. And that was how they got their hands on Kingsley's Westward Ho and Tom Brown's School Days. But it also established their reputation as ethical Christian publishers, which was why, when her first publisher closed down, Charlotte Young, Miss Young, preferred to take her very profitable backlist to them. It was how they came across a woman called Dinah Mulock, who you might know of as Mrs. Crake, the author of John Halifax Gentleman. And it's how they knew Henry and Millicent Garrett Fawcett. And it's how they knew J.R. Green, the historian who wrote the massive best-selling work, A Short History of England. And it's how they met David Matson, who was the editor of Macmillan's magazine, and many more. And it's because they were known to be such strongly Christian publishers that Tennyson developed a close personal relationship with Alexander that led to Macmillan being his last and his most effective publisher. When Tennyson died, it was the firm of Macmillan who organised his funeral in Westminster Abbey. Here are just some of the authors that the Macmillans loved to work with. So you've got Tennyson on the left, Christina Rossetti in the middle, and Charlotte Young right-hand side. Throughout their lives, Daniel and Alexander remained true to the original purpose, that they would be spreading knowledge to all in society, not just the chosen few. It's why it's called literature for the people. They were living in a time of great scientific progress, which shook the foundations of their church and often shook their beliefs. But Alexander never wavered in the course that the two brothers had set, even when it tested his faith. So, although he believed and was always a strong, true Christian believer, he was delighted to publish scientists such as Thomas Huxley and Alfred Russel Wallace and their theories of evolution. And it's why he invested for many years in a loss-making weekly periodical called Nature. So thirdly, and this is my third reason, I think perhaps most importantly, the brothers were incredibly friendly, welcoming, cheerful people who impressed everyone they met with honesty, enthusiasm, and intelligence. They raised the money for their first shop, in the one in Cambridge, from just two men, £250. Think of the money that was in those days, from a partner in the London bookshop where they were just shop assistants. And the bulk of the money, £500, came from Archdeacon Julius Hare. He'd only met Daniel once when he offered the money. He'd met him because he'd invited Daniel to stay at his beautiful house in Sussex to discuss the idea of a newsletter for the working man, which would be full of Christian philosophy and Christian theology. It was a project that never got off the ground, but Daniel had gone to talk to Julius Hare about it, and Julius Hare had obviously remembered. This investment is an enormous leap of faith by Hare. You can only assume that Daniel, in his 20s, had been a very impressive character. And Hare says to him, "Are you well? You look to me like you might not be very well." And Daniel goes off and gets a medical opinion that says, well, yes, I might have consumption, but it's under control. And anyway, I've taken out a life insurance policy. I mean, he doesn't sound like a good bet to me, but Julius Hare puts the money behind him. And Julius had never even met Alexander. I mean, Alexander's just the younger brother at this point. Everyone who met these brothers seems to fall under their spell. So they're in Cambridge. They're right in the middle of the university. And the undergraduates at Cambridge who didn't understand the syllabus and didn't find their tutors of any help at all, they soon discovered that if they went into Macmillan's shop, they didn't just buy the books. They'd be welcomed. They'd be helped. They'd have things explained to them. They'd be invited to stay for tea. And they'd meet other like-minded, confused students. Most of the young men at Cambridge were preparing to take orders. And the Macmillans helped to shape a whole generation of Anglican clergymen. One of Alexander's particular friends from this time, a chap called Sebastian Evans, wrote that for many years afterwards, when he was listening to a sermon, he would often pick up a turn of phrase that seemed to have come directly from fireside conversations in the Macmillan's bookshop. But most importantly, the young men who came into the shop to buy these books and to make friends often went on to become Macmillan authors. It's an incredibly powerful stable of talent at the brothers' disposal. And they're getting them fresh off the press, right out of university. Don't forget, the backbone of the Macmillan publishing business for years, it wasn't fiction, it wasn't poetry, and it certainly wasn't theology, which didn't make them any money at all. It was the school textbook, Latin and Greek primers, and especially maths primers and science primers. titles by mathematicians called Isaac Todd Hunter and Barnard Smith went out by the thousand every year across England and then right across the empire. And these men had been Alexander and Daniel's friends in their 20s, men of their own age, who the brothers published early in their careers, and who then found themselves in later years wealthy and famous, thanks to the Macmillans. So let's talk a little bit more about the books and some of the authors that made the firm so successful. Their first big hit was fiction. It was published a year or so before Daniel died in 1857. It was given to them by the Christian socialist Charles Kingsley. And it's not the usual sort of book at all. It was a big surprise to them that they were publishing it because it was fiction and they were mostly just publishing textbooks and collections of sermons. This is a rip-roaring historical adventure for boys. It's called Westward Ho, with an exclamation mark at the end. It coincides with the outbreak of the Crimean War. And Charles Kingsley wrote it on purpose. He wanted to remind the English, who he thought were being very lily-livered at the time, what great fighters and warriors there had been among the English and what they could achieve. It hit a very receptive public and it made a lot of money for the firm. And there aren't many books that get a holiday resort named after them. There is actually, for those of you in America who might not know this, a town in Devon to this day called Westward Ho, and it gets its name from this book and not the other way around. The next big hit is Tom Brown's School Days, and that comes out in 1857. It comes out literally as Daniel is dying, and it could have been the firm's swan song. After all, it was Daniel whose vision, ambition, drive had encouraged the brothers to start the firm in the first place. But in fact, Daniel dying seems to inspire Alexander to even greater things. Or possibly Daniel, in his ill health, had been holding Alexander back, or maybe a bit of both. But within 2 years, Alexander opens a London office. The first shop was in Henrietta Street, in the heart of Covent Garden, and it's gone. But here you can see on the left, that's 1 Trinity Street, Cambridge, which was the main Macmillan bookshop in Cambridge for many years. It's still a bookshop to this day. It's Cambridge University Press's bookshop, and it's where I launched the paperback of Literature for the People, so that was lovely. The shop on the right is Bedford Street. It's not a bookshop anymore, but it was built to Alexander Macmillan's design. It's still there to this day. And the money to support the building mostly came from Oxford University Press, because by then Alexander was their publisher. But I'll come on to that in a moment. So now Alexander set about building a London network to rival that of Cambridge. He started hosting Thursday evening events, which he called Tobacco Parliaments. They were an open house with beer and whiskey and talk for anyone who fancied it or who he fancied. Tobacco and tipple. He used to invite them for tobacco and tipple. And thus he developed a great following of new young authors, newcomers like Matthew Arnold and Thomas Huxley, who found themselves rubbing shoulders with the Rossetti brothers, and Tennyson and F.D. Maurice and Charles Kingsley and Tom Hughes. This is the table that Tom Hughes had made for Alexander to have in his rooms when he was hosting these events. They were involved in something called the Working Men's College in London, where craftsmen could go in to be educated in the evenings. And one of the craftsmen, a carpenter who went to the Working Men's College, made this table for Tom Hughes to give to Alexander. And the authors who used to go regularly scribbled their name, engraved their name, almost like they'd done it with a biro, around the rim. And if you look, you can just about see Palgrave, you can see Huxley, you can see Thomas Hughes. This table is still held by the Macmillan family. This is in Lord Stockton's private room, and I was allowed to go and see it. So I was very touched by it all. It was lovely. Lots of really important publishing projects were inspired by conversations around this table, including the decision to feature Christina Rossetti as a poet in Macmillan's magazine. And there's a lovely story about that. So the Rossetti brothers, Dante Gabriel and William, were regular. They used to like a bit of tobacco and tipple. They were regular attendees at the Tobacco Parliament. And one day, one of them says to Alexander, would you just look at this couple of poems my sister's written? And Alexander looks and says, let's put them in Macmillan's magazine. And he does, and they go very well. And he says to them, has she got anything else? And they say, well, she's written this really extraordinary thing called Goblin Market. It's a weird fairy tale. We showed it to John Ruskin and he said nobody would publish it. So Alexander Macmillan says, well, let me have a look. And he takes it back to Cambridge, where he's still living. And he reads it, and then he goes along to the Working Men's Association one evening, and he writes to the Rossetti brothers and said, "I read your sister's poem out loud to the working men of Cambridge." And at first they were a bit surprised, and then they got very silent, and at the end they all applauded. So I think we should go ahead and publish it. And I mean, for anyone who knows Goblin Market, I cannot imagine what the working men of Cambridge made of it. But anyway, it was a great success from Alexander's point of view. I'm going to just read a little bit from the book now, if I can get to the right page, about the setting up of Macmillan's magazine, which was Alexander's other great project from 1859. It was at Alexander's Tobacco Parliament gatherings and in the correspondence that surrounded them that Macmillan was encouraged to launch a magazine. John Ludlow, who's a Christian Scientist, was persistent in the view that Macmillan and Company needed a periodical of its own. He used Hughes's Tom Brown School Days to illustrate his point. "I suspect you'll have some difficulty in getting for it all the success it deserves offhand, coming from an entirely new author. Now, if that same Tom Brown had been published in a magazine, for which it is admirably adapted, not only would it have increased the sale of the magazine largely as it went on, but by the time it had got to the end, it would no longer be a book by a new hand. It would, on being republished as a whole, just step into success instead of having to fight its way in." This, after all, was how Pickwick Papers had made Dickens's name 20 years earlier. The launch of a magazine was not without substantial financial risk. New publication would need to identify and occupy a niche in an already crowded marketplace. At the top end of the market were the long-established quarterlies, the Edinburgh Reviews, John Murray's Quarterly Review, priced at £0.50, and more popular was Dickens's weekly magazine, Household Words, launched in 1850 and priced at twopence, or Blackwood's, an Edinburgh-based periodical which specialised in serial fiction. And then there were magazines specifically aimed at women, such as Samuel Beeton's, made famous by the contributions on cookery written by his wife Isabella. But most educated women would have been secondary readers of titles such as Blackwood's, bought them by their husbands or their fathers. Alexander wanted to make sure that even the most learned articles in his magazine would be accessible in vocabulary and style to those who lacked a university education. And the advertisers of expensive fabric and servants' clothes who took space in the magazine were reaching out to a prosperous and educated female readership. All agreed that a monthly magazine was the perfect opportunity to showcase Macmillan's extensive network of writers, philosophers, scientists, and educationalists. By the time the publication finally reached fruition, Macmillan had determined that he would make it more than just a mouthpiece for the Christian Socialist movement, which had been Ludlow's plan. He wanted to call it the Round Table, and abandoning the idealism of Hughes and Ludlow would allow authors to remain anonymous if they preferred, as long as their contributions were popular, plain, and good. In the spring of 1859, he took himself off to Scotland to clear his head and to consult his friend Maclehose, bouncing his idea off other publishers. Their feedback determined him to proceed, but on his own terms. Cleverly, he laid off the majority of the financial risk, taking £250 in a partnership with Tom Hughes, and £250 each contributed as goods and services rather than cash from the printer and the paper merchant to whom he gave exclusive contracts. He was keen to release the first instalment in October 1859 to give the magazine a good 3 months clear before the launch of a competitive title, rumoured to be called The Cornhill and to be edited by Thackeray. Then a further month's delay was necessary to allow Tom Hughes to cope with an appalling family tragedy, the death by drowning of his young son, the boy for whom Tom Brown's School Days had been written. Finally, the first issue was set for November 1859, and the editorship was offered, at Hughes's suggestion, to a 37-year-old Scottish academic called David Masson. This infuriated John Ludlow, who'd wanted the role for himself. It was Masson, after a fierce struggle with Macmillan, which Macmillan lost, who chose the much simpler title, Macmillan's Magazine. Alexander may not have felt that his surname was sufficiently well known to attract attention, but on the other hand, if the magazine was a success, the firm would benefit from the publicity. On its launch in November 1859, Macmillan's magazine consisted of 80 closely typeset double-columned pages, 6 inches by 8.5, and included 8 lengthy, rather literary pieces, But the principal draw was the eagerly awaited first instalment of Hughes's sequel, Tom Brown at Oxford. And there were worthy essays on politics in Italy and a long poem by one of the Lushington brothers. Priced at £1, it was the first of the shilling monthly periodicals, as the following year George Smith indeed did issue the Cornhill, which would be a friendly rival to Macmillan's for the next several decades. Many more followed suit less successfully, but it was Macmillan's that set the pace, and its success must be attributed to the very great care that Alexander took with it. The publisher did far more to set the tone of any article and contributions than the editors, usually by tactful negotiation and persuasion. So, Macmillan and the Tobacco Parliament is going to come up with a few more big ideas as well. There's Palgrave's Golden Treasury, which came out in 1861. It might have had Palgrave's name on the title, but the rumour went round that it actually was a selection of poems made by Tennyson, and Alexander did nothing to discourage that rumour, and it flew off the shelves. It led to a whole series of other treasuries, collections of ballads, of children's verse, of hymns. And then there was the Globe Shakespeare, a one-volume complete works of Shakespeare, pocket-sized, which remained the standard school textbook for nearly a century. This is an idea that had been brought to Alexander in 1861 by the public orator of Cambridge University, a man called Clarke. He said that there were several early folios of Shakespeare in Trinity College Library, and that someone should produce a carefully annotated edition in just the same way that they worked on Greek and Latin texts. And he brought in 2 other men to help him, one of whom became well known, a chap called Aldous Wright, and they did the whole thing in 3 years. It's an extraordinary achievement. And then Macmillan says, okay, that's great, that's the Cambridge Shakespeare, but let's make it small and let's put it in everyone's pocket and let's call it a one-volume Globe Shakespeare. And that one-volume complete works of Shakespeare, pocket size, remained the standard school textbook for nearly a century. The next big step in the firm's progress came in 1863, when Alexander relocated his family and the centre of the publishing business to London. The house he took in Tooting for his wife and children, and for Daniel's widow Fanny and her children, so there's 8 kids now, all under Alexander's roof. It's still there. If any of you live anywhere near Tooting, you can walk past this every day. After so many years living above the shop in Cambridge, living in this extraordinarily, well, it's not necessarily beautiful, but it's a very large, grand house, and it must have felt like they'd really arrived. It coincided with Alexander's appointment as publisher to Oxford University Press. It's the first time the university had appointed a commercial manager to help them in modernising their catalogue and developing a series of school textbooks called the Clarendon series. This gave Alexander a whole new catalogue to take to market, and it introduced him to the circle of Oxford academics that he hadn't known before, one of whom is a shy young mathematician called Charles Dodgson. Now, I could spend a whole hour on the extraordinary publishing phenomenon that is Alice in Wonderland, and I can very happy to take questions on it afterwards. But although it became one of the firm's most famous titles, and it did consume, and Charles Dodgson as an author consumed an amazing amount of Alexander's time and energy, they only ever published these books on a 10% commission from Dodgson, who owned the copyright and took all the publishing risks himself on every book he ever wrote. So by this time, Alexander's becoming well known around London as a host to literary celebrities, either at his house in Tooting or at the Garrick Club in London. He particularly enjoyed hosting a party on the 1st of April every year, All Fool's Day. The Elms, which you can see at the top of the menu on the left, is what Knapdale, the house in Tooting, was originally called. Alexander very romantically changes its name to Knapdale later on. Knapdale is meant to be the ancestral home of the Macmillan clan. It's not somewhere the Macmillans Alexander had ever lived, but he wanted to feel that it was part of the clan, so he renames his house Knapdale. And you can see on the right-hand side, there's some of the people who've signed it. Top left, you can see Robert Browning, you can see John Everett Millais. There's a similar one from another year with Matthew Arnold and Thomas Huxley. His close interest in new ideas led to his publishing in exciting new fields. So he encourages Henry Fawcett in his political economy, or as we call it, economics textbooks, a whole new field of publishing in the 1850s and 60s. He also encourages Henry's wife, Millicent, to put some of her ideas into writing. So he is the first publisher of Millicent Garrett Fawcett's essays on the rights of women. He'd been publishing The Supporters of Charles Darwin ever since 1859, when The Origin of Species came out. He'd managed to get Huxley's first review of this work into Macmillan's magazine. He also published Alfred Russel Wallace, the other great exponent of evolutionary theory. And in 1869, this interest in science and discovery led him to take a really brave step. He launched a weekly magazine to keep scientists around the world up to date with the latest discoveries and theories. And here it is, still going strong today, Nature. On the right-hand side, you can see the very first edition. It was edited by a young, enthusiastic astronomer called Norman Lockyer, and it did indeed take 20 years to turn a profit. At this point, Alexander has a non-family member as a publisher in the firm, a chap called George Liddy Craik. Craik is appalled by Nature. I think he wants it to stop, but Alexander keeps going. He will not stop. The other thing Alexander does in 1869, because he's clearly a man who never is frightened of a risk, he opens an office in New York. He's one of the first British publishing houses to make a success of the transatlantic trade in what were really difficult market conditions. Alexander had always been fascinated by America. His periodical, Macmillan's Magazine, was one of the only British papers, along with The Spectator, to support the North and the anti-slavery cause during the American Civil War. And in 1867, Alexander took himself off to visit the States. He goes to New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. He meets with as many publishers and booksellers and famous authors as he can. And that's typical of his approach to business. He does his homework, and he backs his own judgment, and he takes a risk. From the late 1870s onwards, Alexander's sons and nephews begin to join in the business, and slowly over time, Alexander withdrew from the day-to-day management, physically exhausted after 30 years of back-breaking, eye-straining effort. They give up the house in Tooting. Alexander donates it to the church, and a beautiful new home, Bramshot Chase, was built out in the countryside near Hazelmere. During the week when he was working, they rented a house in Portland Place in the centre of London. In 1889, a catalogue of everything the firm had ever published was produced, and there are some new and exciting authors listed: Thomas Hardy, Henry James, Rudyard Kipling. By this stage, perhaps dearest of all to Alexander's heart, devoted fan as he was, they were the publishers of Alfred Lord Tennyson. But for me, as I said, this is as much a family biography as a business history. And along the way, Alexander has had to deal with some extraordinarily tough family issues, grief, sadness, all of which undoubtedly add to the strains he was under and contributed to a relatively early death at the age of 77. In the early 1850s, both brothers married. They married smart, well-educated daughters of the Cambridge merchant class. They were already coming up in society. They both had families, started families, all of whom shared papers and memories with me when I was writing this book, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. They've been so supportive. Daniel and Fanny had 4 children, the last of these being born just a few weeks before Daniel died. The oldest 2 were boys, Frederick and Morris, named for Frederick Morris, of course, and they joined the firm. Frederick spent his early career in New York, helping George Brett to establish a business there, and he becomes a champion of the publishing industry, the main promoter of the Netbook Agreement of 1899. Morris Macmillan spent a couple of years. Morris was the lucky one. He was allowed to go off to university. Alexander wasn't a great believer in any of these boys going to university, but Morris got there. Morris spent a couple of years teaching at a public school before he joined the firm, and he was responsible for building its export trade and opening overseas branches. And it's his son, Harold, who in later life becomes Prime Minister. But Harold Macmillan is also an active partner in the firm, along with his brothers. And in between the various peaks and troughs of his political career, he spent a lot of time working in Macmillan. Daniel's 3rd son, Arthur, died at the age of 19 of the same illness that had killed his father. Alexander's immediate family is not without its own share of tragedies. In 1866, his little boy, William, died suddenly of some awful unspecified childhood illness. He was just 2. His first wife, Alexander's first wife, Caroline, dies of heart failure 5 years later in 1871. But in the following year, Alexander, with 8 children under the age of 20, all living in his house in Tooting, he takes a very wise step of remarrying a younger woman, half French, attractive, clever, called Emma, who will be a great literary hostess alongside Alexander. She gave him 2 more children, Mary and John, and she encouraged him to step back from work and enjoy travelling and holidaying on the continent. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to end as the book does with this. In 1910, the firm published a biography of Alexander, who died in 1896, and his son George sent presentation copies to many of the old Scottish friends and to all the staff and the servants, the family servants. Among the many grateful replies, full of reverence for an old friend or master, came one from a man called Frank Clark, whose father George had been a gardener at Knapdale. Dear Sir, I'm afraid I cannot adequately thank you for the splendid book you have sent me, The Life and Letters of My Dear Master. How often I have longed for this. I felt sure it would be published and often wondered who would write it. It is the grandest book in every respect I have ever had, and it arrived on his birthday, the 3rd of October, a day when my mind has always naturally turned to some of the happiest and best times of my life, those days at Knapdale and Bramshot Chase. Some of my earliest recollections are associated with the garden at Knapdale, where I generally spent my holidays. For years, I quite thought it was my father's garden, and I can remember now the name and position of every tree and shrub. Later in life, I was privileged to live in the house and wait on the master. I was awfully awkward and nervous, but he quickly helped me to overcome that, and it was not long before I looked for the time when he came in from Bedford Street. He taught me everything I know about books, and gave me Tom Brown at Oxford to read aloud to the maids in the hall. It was a red-letter day to me when shortly after this Mr. Hughes himself came to dinner, and I had the pleasure of hearing him talk. I'd seen him once before when he planted the mulberry tree in Knapdale Gardens. I often think over the scenes in the picture gallery of my memory, associated with my life of 10 years under your father's roof, and feel very grateful that I had such a fine introduction into life. He showed me how to look for the best and highest in everything, and instilled into my young mind the very finest principles and ideals. Anything of real worth in my character, I can now trace back to those memorable days, and I feel I owe your family a big debt that I can never hope to repay. It's hard to imagine a better epitaph. That's it. Thank you very much, and I'm really happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah.